From brutal tackles to life-threatening collisions, the sport of rugby is one of the most physically demanding sports ever created. It pits the best of the best against one another, and pride is often the driving factor, spurring players on to make split-second decisions. But while we're all aware of the laws, adrenaline often throws the rulebook out the window, and players let their primal instinct of fight or flight take over. From a spectator's point of view, it's fun to see these beasts of the game destroy one another on the field, but for those players it can often lead to career-ending injuries. Fortunately, World Rugby has been echoing the calls of medical experts and players in an attempt to make the game safe. However, through all this, it seems like fans are shying away from the game. Others are becoming more frustrated than ever when the game is held up from yet another TMO intervention. So join us today as we look at these new laws and figure out how long it would take us fans and players to get used to them. Or are we doomed to have the Rugby World Cup tournaments decided on discipline and whoever gets to manipulate the rules the best? You see, World Rugby, formerly known as the IRB or International Rugby Board, often has the final say when it comes to dictating the way the sport goes. Experts and former players are often board members, and through years of experience monitoring the world of rugby, they understand how to make the game better. For the governing body, striking a balance between safety for the players and entertainment for the fans is equally important. If the rules become too strict, fans will simply move away and call the sport overregulated. But if measures are not taken to control the players, it can get out of hand, and what should be a show of sportsmanship could soon turn into hatred. You should also keep in mind that since the rise of John Olomu, players have grown into monsters, and contrary to popular belief, players are now in far better physical condition than they were in the late 90s and early 2000s. But your opinion is always welcome if you think the 90s players could still dominate today. With this massive rise in physicality and brute strength, tackles become far more ferocious, and should Eben Etzebeth hit you with the shoulder to the head at full force, it would certainly be more painful than it would have been 20 or 30 years ago. So, how has World Rugby decided to step in? Back in the early days of professional rugby, many incidents were often seen as an accident. A full-blown shoulder to the head of a player dipping into a tackle would often warrant a yellow card, and in rare cases, a red. For referees, keeping the game as exciting as possible was always the goal, and you don't want to give the edge to someone else unless absolutely necessary. But after new research has shown that shots to the head of players can be far more life-threatening than once thought, something had to change. Patrick Lambie, the former Sharks and Springbok utility back, is one of the best examples. The young star was forced to retire at just 28 due to multiple concussions. For World Rugby, it seemed to be the final nail in the coffin, and many said that something needed to be done. And at the 2019 World Cup, we would already see records being broken for cards, with it turning into the most card-heavy tournament ever played. To put it in perspective, 8 red cards were shown in Japan, whilst the previous 5 World Cups before 2019 would only have a combination of 5 red cards. In fact, there were no red cards given in the 2003 iteration of the global spectacle. So this does mean that the 2019 edition stands as the dirtiest World Cup ever to be played on record. But we think 2023 will supersede this, and card statistics are about to double. Now, you might be thinking that this should not even matter, and many teams don't even need to feel the impact when someone is the sin bin for 10 minutes. Well, the stats from the 2019 World Cup might disagree. If we only focus on the 36 pool games that were played during the 2019 Rugby World Cup, we see that 27 yellow cards were dished out before the finals rolled around, which is also a massive increase from the 2015 edition. But perhaps the most striking effect is that 33 tries were scored whilst the opposition team was reduced to 14 men. Yes, there are plenty of mismatches that occurred during the tournament, but this still exceeds the number of points put on the board when one team has a player in the bin compared to any other World Cup tournament in history. Jumping a few years forward, we can have a look at a more recent game played in this year between the Springboks and New Zealand. Now, bear in mind that these two teams are by no means mismatched, so it gives us an idea of what could happen when two strong teams meet and how games could be affected by overzealous officials. You see, the build-up had been intense, and while the Springboks did apply plenty of pressure on the All Blacks. 2 quick yellow cards a few minutes apart would significantly impact the outcome of the game. The Boks kept piling on pressure after the first yellow, and this eventually led to the second. And if the All Blacks survived another onslaught, they would probably have to withstand another yellow card, with the penalties piling up. We all know how the All Blacks never recaptured the momentum and eventually lost the game, but a total of 3 yellow cards and 1 red card had been given. So as you can see, the big issue is not the cards given for blatant foul play, but rather the number of cards given out for normal infringements that stack up on top of each other. You see, cards were often reserved for severe foul play or cynical infringements. If someone blatantly tackles another player high or in the air, that certainly warrants a card. Also, when someone commits a cynical offence by tripping another player or disrupting play by purposely breaking the rules, cards have a place. However, a new emphasis is being placed on what is deemed to be repeated infringements, which often seems like an attempt from World Rugby to punish a team by sending off whoever committed the last offence after a warning is given, and this doesn't seem to sit well with fans. Let me give you an example. A player can go an entire year without committing a card-worthy offence, but now his team is on a warning, and a simple infringement like not rolling away could send a player, known to abide by the rules, to the sin bin, often tarnishing his clean disciplinary record. Fortunately, the rules on repeated infringements were not as closely monitored as they are today, which meant that struggling teams could often survive receiving a card when having to deal with pressure in previous World Cup tournaments. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like the same fate awaits weaker teams in the future. Another major effect that World Rugby might have forgotten about is how teams and players are now using these rules to their advantage. It seems like the best coaches have found a way to make the rules work in their favour, with no one as good as this as the Springboks. Now, one thing that rugby has seen in the last 2 decades is the way that coaches try to find ways to make laws work in their favour. Some are better at this than others, and when teams are mismatched, it can quickly turn into a festival of cards being handed out. You see, one reason for this is the rule that World Rugby tried to make the game more exciting. By encouraging teams to go for 5 points instead of 3, we see fewer and fewer games decided by the boot of kickers. However, when a mismatch does occur, teams seem to milk it, and there's nothing wrong with this, as it's exactly what the rules were made to do. But what World Rugby might have failed to consider is that once a player is sent to the sin bin, a mismatch often occurs, and since the repeated infringement rule still applies, teams can use this mismatch to continue milking away these penalties, getting another yellow card and another and another. Whilst this is unlikely to be as severe when we see the top nations play, a game between Namibia and the All Blacks could spell doom for the weaker nation. Since there's already a mismatch, the All Blacks can continue to exploit this after the first yellow card and force scrums and driving mauls to force the weaker team into conceding repeated infringements. This could force a weaker nation into rather conceding a try than desperately defending the stronger team with fewer players. So, how will this play out in the future? One thing we always love is when an underdog can overcome the odds and knock off one of the big nations. If you remember when Japan narrowly beat the Springboks in 2015, or when Western Samoa beat Wales in 1991, you will understand the thrill of a changing status quo. However, it seems like the rules are now more skewed towards momentum. In fact, the team with the most moments at the start can go on to dominate the game if they so choose, leaving the days of the weaker nations thriving on chaos as something from the past. While the need for strict laws to protect the players is certainly something we all want to see, the rules to make the game more exciting might mean that we will never see the likes of weak nations knocking off Tier 1 teams again. It seems like the top 8 nations in World Rugby will find a way to manipulate these rules against weaker teams, whilst momentum will be the biggest defining factor when the most powerful rugby nations collide. Yes, it does make for a more unpredictable game when we consider the build-up between these nations, but in many cases, 2 yellow cards for repeated infringements during the first half could yet decide the game. But now, it's your turn to let us know in the comments section if you think that the days of those nail-biting last 20 minutes are gone.